For most people, I believe that enhancing one's level of tenacity and willpower would be advantageous. Now, you'll be relieved to know that while there are a near infinite number of different circumstances where one would need to draw on tenacity and willpower in order to succeed, there is one major mechanism within the brain, indeed one major mechanism, by which tenacity and willpower are generated. And it arrives through the activation of a particular brain center that is a hub. That is, it lies at the interface of many other neural circuits and has input from all the critical neural circuits that one would need in order to generate tenacity and willpower. In other words, understanding the psychology of tenacity and willpower, while valuable, if it's coupled with an understanding of the underlying neural mechanism, and notice I used the singular, neural mechanism, not mechanisms, for generating tenacity and willpower, will allow you to use and to tailor the specific protocols for enhancing tenacity and willpower to your unique circumstances. So this is yet another case where certainly life circumstances vary from one person to the next. The need for tenacity and willpower varies tremendously. For instance, some people may need more tenacity and willpower in order to engage in certain behaviors. Others of us might need more tenacity and willpower in order to resist certain types of behaviors. Today, you will learn about the brain center that governs all of that. And then you can frame it within the psychological understanding of tenacity and willpower so that you can get the most out of the protocols that we will discuss. Let's start by talking about what tenacity and willpower clearly are and separating tenacity and willpower from some other psychological constructs that they often get confused with. Habit execution is what you do anytime you wake up in the morning. Maybe you lie there for a bit. Maybe you get out of bed immediately. Hopefully you get outside and get some sunlight in your eyes, especially on cloudy days. Go brush your teeth, use the restroom, engage with others in your home if you live with others, etc. All of those sorts of behaviors, while on some days can be a bit more challenging, especially the get out of bed part. Maybe you didn't get a great night's sleep the night before, for instance. But all of those sorts of behaviors are behaviors that you have the neural circuits to generate, and that typically you can generate without a lot of willpower required. Now, willpower, sometimes also referred to as tenacity, grit, or persistence, is a distinctly different phenomenon than habit execution, because willpower and tenacity require that we intervene in our own default neural processes, such as habits or particular patterns of thinking, and essentially govern ourselves to do or not do some particular thing. And that process requires effort. It requires energy. Feed the energetics of the brain, the energy required to engage in or to resist in a particular behavior. And that level of energy can be quite high, depending on how much resistance we are feeling internally or externally, right? Somebody can be telling us you're not going to be able to do this. You can't do it. And you can say, no, I have a ton of resolve. I have a ton of tenacity, willpower, and I'm going to push past all the barriers that you are setting up for me on the outside. Oftentimes, all too often, I should say, we experience resistance from the inside, where we are feeling like we don't want to do something, or we really want to do something, and we are having trouble either engaging in the thing that we don't want to do, or that we know we should do, but we just don't feel that level of motivation for, or we are having a hard time resisting the thing that's pulling us toward it. So in that context, it's important for us not to just distinguish tenacity and willpower from habit execution, but also draw out a continuum with tenacity and willpower at their most extreme on one end of that continuum, and apathy and, yes, depression, formal study of willpower in the laboratory context, that is, bringing human subjects into the laboratory and examining what sorts of conditions allow them to engage their willpower and tenacity, what sorts of conditions really sap or drain their willpower and tenacity, and, of course, parallel experiments done in what we call preclinical models, which are animal studies, have revealed to us a lot about the sorts of conditions that allow us to generate willpower and the sorts of conditions that drain our willpower. That willpower is a limited resource, much like fuel in the body or fuel in a car. Now, the idea of willpower as a limited resource is certainly not a new idea, but again, the formal study of willpower and willpower as a limited resource really dates back a little over 25 years when Roy Baumeister and colleagues started to explore the idea that, of course, had been kicked around for years, that with each additional decision that we have to engage across the day, and with each additional bout of willpower that we have to draw on as a resource, that we would drain this reservoir of willpower that we all have within us. Now, Baumeister and colleagues referred to that process as ego depletion. When Baumeister referred to ego depletion, he was defining ego depletion as a concept of oneself and a concept of outside challenges, and the degree of effort required to bridge one's concept of self and those challenges. Tenacity and willpower in some cases is a limited resource that can be replenished by engaging particular processes within the body. That's right, within the body. But that willpower and tenacity, and most importantly, how to engage tenacity and willpower, especially when you have a lot of challenges in front of you, not just one challenge, but multiple challenges that need to be carried out throughout the day, over weeks, over months, etc., that tenacity and willpower can be drawn upon repeatedly without them being depleted if you are clear on your beliefs about tenacity and willpower. So I realize that what I just brought up was a controversy about something that I haven't even discussed yet. So it might seem like a bit of a swirl of information for which there's really no context. But the reason I bring up the controversy at this stage of our conversation is that the moment that the words ego depletion or willpower as a limited resource falls out of my mouth, I can hear those voices out there saying, wait a second, I thought that was all debunked. And I want to make very clear, willpower as a limited resource and ego depletion have not been debunked. It's simply a controversial area of psychological research. And more importantly, for today's discussion, we have to understand the theory of willpower as a limited resource if we are to understand the controversy, that is the counter argument of what willpower really is, that comes from other groups. Okay, so let's take a look at the evidence that willpower is a limited resource. I think most of us are familiar with what willpower feels like. That is, what it feels like to be tenacious. And again, there are two sides to this coin. There's willpower and tenacity of the sort of trying to engage in a behavior when we really don't want to, or when our impulse is not to engage in that behavior. And I say when our impulse is not to engage in that behavior because oftentimes we want to engage in the behavior. We want to study. We want to learn the instrument. We want to perform well. We want to exercise. We want the benefits of all those things. So it's not that we don't want the outcomes or the rewards of those things. And in many cases, it's not that we don't enjoy those activities, but that for whatever reason, we are feeling a lack of motivation. We're drifting down that continuum toward the more apathetic end of things. Hopefully not all the way to deep depression and apathy, but we're drifting that way, or we're not far enough up the continuum and we're not engaging enough motivation to feel like the desire to do something, either for its own sake or for the rewards and outcomes of that thing, are sufficient to allow us to just do that thing. Hence the Nike slogan, just do it, which is a wonderful slogan, except that in the absence of any understanding about the mechanisms of how we can get ourselves to just do something, oftentimes it falls short. And to be honest, anytime I hear about people saying, well, just eliminate the thinking and just do it, that is valuable advice until it doesn't work. Because when it doesn't work, it simply doesn't work. And then you need to rely on other tools and mechanisms, which are the sort that we will talk about today. So while I have great respect for the just do it mantra, when it doesn't work, it doesn't offer any alternative solutions to engage tenacity and willpower. And there will be days when telling yourself, just do this or just don't do that is not going to be sufficient for you to engage in the behaviors or resist the behaviors or thoughts that you need to engage in or resist. That's just reality. And we should ask ourselves, why is that reality? And this is a very important point. Because what we know for certain is that the regions of the brain that generate tenacity, and again, there is literally a brain hub for generating willpower and tenacity, gets strong input from the so-called autonomic nervous system. Therefore, it's an active process. So the sympathetic nervous system is all the things of action. And when it is involved in generating inaction, those are cases where inaction requires energy, okay? I want to be very clear about this. The sympathetic nervous system isn't just about moving our body, although it has a lot to do with that. It is also responsible for our ability to resist movement or thought or emotion when we need to do that, clamp down on ourselves. The parasympathetic aspect of our autonomic nervous system is the one that's sometimes referred to as the rest and digest neural circuits and chemicals. And that's true, but there's a lot more to the parasympathetic component of the autonomic nervous system. It's also responsible for falling asleep. It's responsible for us feeling relaxed. It is responsible for most of the states of mind and body in which we are quiescent, where we don't feel an impulse to move, or when we have a difficult time getting into action. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic aspect of the autonomic nervous system are always in a push-pull with one another. Think of them more or less on a teeter-totter. When one end goes up, the other end goes down. They're really in competition with one another, and it's their balance that reflects how alert or how sleepy we happen to be. Now, the reason I'm giving you this rather geeky, nerd speak, nomenclature-filled discussion about the autonomic nervous system in the context of willpower is that regardless of whether or not you believe willpower is a limited or an unlimited resource, we know one thing for sure, and that's that willpower and tenacity ride on our current autonomic function. We can translate that to everyday language by saying that when we are well rested, for instance, when we've been getting great sleep of sufficient duration the previous night and the night before that, our level of tenacity and willpower to engage in things that we would not ordinarily engage in by default, and our ability to resist behaviors and thought patterns that would otherwise be our default behaviors and thought patterns, is much higher. Conversely, when we are not getting enough quality sleep on a regular basis, our ability to call on tenacity and willpower is diminished. Now, that series of statements I just made is clearly going to be a duh for most people, but it is very important to understand that when we are sleep deprived, when we are in physical pain, when we are in emotional pain, and or when we are distracted, when we are thinking about something else aside from what we are trying to engage tenacity and willpower in order to do or not do, tenacity and willpower will be diminished. Now, all of those things together are just a bigger duh. We all know this. If you've got a splinter in your foot, it's really hard to think about not thinking about something else. If you are extremely hungry, or if you had an argument with somebody that you really care about and they said something that was particularly vexing to you and it's looping around in your head, it's going to be very hard to engage in something else that you need to do because you're going to be distracted. Likewise, if you're sleep deprived, likewise, if you are a bit sick or run down, or if you're in any kind of physical or emotional pain, your ability to draw on tenacity and willpower will be diminished. So it's an absolute truth that your ability to generate tenacity and willpower rides on a reservoir of autonomic function. In balance, that is, the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems of your autonomic nervous system are in the best possible balance to generate tenacity and willpower. We don't yet have such a metric, although there are companies that are starting to develop devices that hopefully will give us indices of autonomic function or dysfunction. But it is important that we acknowledge that if you're not taking care of the foundational modulators of tenacity and willpower, sleep and magnesium threonate, it would take you to those particular protocols, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I don't want to get too far off topic here during today's discussion, but if you're not sleeping well, and if you're not managing your stress levels well, it's going to be much harder for you to engage tenacity and willpower